Winter came early to the eastern edge of Europe in 1941, arriving not as a season, but as a sentence. By September, the roads leading into Leningrad were already thick with mud and broken vehicles, the residue of retreat and panic, pressed into the earth by millions of boots. German artillery stood within range of the city's outer districts, and the ring was closing with mechanical certainty. Leningrad was not merely a target of military value, it was a symbol, a name heavy with revolution, industry, and defiance. The decision was made quietly, without ceremony, in command tents far from the Neva River. The city would not be stormed, it would be starved. Rail lines were severed, food depots burned, power stations fell silent one by one. What could not be taken by force would be erased by time and hunger. Inside the city, nearly 3 million civilians remained, including hundreds of thousands of children. They listened as the distant thunder of artillery settled into a grim rhythm, less an attack than a reminder. The siege had begun, and with it a struggle measured not in days or victories, but in calories, minutes, and the thin margin between endurance and collapse. This was not a battle that would announce itself with dramatic movements of armies. It would unfold in kitchens and stairwells, in factories that continued to operate without heat, and in the quiet resolve of people who understood, almost immediately, that survival itself had become an act of resistance. Leningrad in 1941 was a city already strained before the first encirclement tightened. Factories ran day and night, producing tanks, shells, and aircraft parts, even as evacuation trains carried machinery eastward in desperate attempts to preserve industrial capacity. The population swelled as refugees from the Baltic and Western regions poured in, bringing little more than exhaustion and fear. When the final rail connection was cut in early September, warehouses still held supplies, but distribution was chaotic, and planning had not accounted for complete isolation. Bread rations were introduced almost immediately, calculated with mathematical precision that could not hide their inadequacy. Workers received more than dependents. Children received less than anyone. Each announcement of reduced rations landed like a physical blow, forcing families to renegotiate daily life around smaller and smaller portions. The city administration struggled to maintain order, issuing posters calling for calm and discipline, even as queues stretched for hours in freezing rain. Bombardments damaged bakeries and water mains, compounding scarcity with disruption. The Neva River, wide and implacable, became both barrier and promise. As autumn faded, the hope was that winter would harden its surface, creating a road where none existed. Until then, Leningrad was an island surrounded by enemy positions and its own growing desperation. The first deaths from starvation were recorded quietly, often attributed to illness to preserve morale. But the truth was visible in faces that grew sharper by the week, in the way people moved more slowly, conserving energy they could not replace. By November, the temperature dropped sharply, and with it any remaining illusion that the siege would be short. Apartments grew cold as fuel ran out, and residents dismantled furniture for firewood, feeding stoves with table legs and door frames. Electricity flickered, then failed entirely in many districts, plunging stairwells into darkness that felt absolute. Elevators stopped, trapping the elderly in upper floors or confining them below, unable to climb. Bread, the final anchor of daily sustenance, became a gray, dense substance, stretched with sawdust and cellulose. Official rations fell to their lowest point, 125 grams per day for dependents and children. It was not enough to sustain life, only to delay death. Bodies weakened rapidly, Immune systems collapsed, and disease. By November, the temperature dropped sharply, and with it any remaining illusion that the siege would be short. Apartments grew cold as fuel ran out, and residents dismantled furniture for firewood, feeding stoves with table legs and door frames. Electricity flickered, then failed entirely in many districts, plunging stairwells into darkness that felt absolute. Elevators stopped, trapping the elderly in upper floors or confining them below, unable to climb. Bread, the final anchor of daily sustenance, became a gray, dense substance, stretched with sawdust and cellulose. Official rations fell to their lowest point, 125 grams per day for dependents and children. It was not enough to sustain life, only to delay death. Bodies weakened rapidly, immune systems collapsed, and disease spread through unheated rooms. Yet factories continued to operate. Workers wrapped themselves in rags and stood at machines with numb fingers, driven by a combination of duty, coercion, and a stubborn refusal to surrender the city without resistance. Air raids continued, often striking residential areas rather than military targets, their explosions muffled by snow. The sound of shelling became so constant that it faded into the background, less alarming than the silence that followed when someone failed to wake. The siege pressed inward, reshaping priorities. Conversations narrowed to food, warmth, and the weather. Everything else receded, including fear, which required energy no one could spare. Death did not arrive dramatically in Leningrad. It accumulated. It took neighbors, then relatives, then entire stairwells. The city's burial system collapsed under the scale of loss, and bodies were dragged on sleds through streets lined with snowdrifts and debris. Mass graves were dug in frozen ground with tools that broke as often as they worked. Despite this, civic institutions struggled to maintain records, names written carefully even as hands shook from cold and hunger. Schools closed, but teachers continued to meet children in apartments, attempting to preserve routines that anchored sanity. The libraries stayed open as long as possible, not for research, but for warmth and quiet. The radio broadcast a steady stream of music and announcements, its persistence itself a form of defiance. When the power failed, loudspeakers were connected to generators, ensuring that the city still had a voice. Dmitri Shostakovich began composing his Seventh Symphony within the city during the siege, writing while wearing a firefighter's helmet during air raids. The act of composition, like factory work, became another way to assert existence. Yet these gestures did not blunt hunger. People traded possessions for food, first jewelry, then clothing, then books. When nothing remained, they traded time, standing in lines for hours in hope rather than expectation. The siege transformed morality into a series of compromises dictated by survival, and judging them from a distance would later prove both easy and meaningless. Outside the city, German forces settled into positions designed not to breach defenses, but to hold them. Artillery batteries were emplaced with care, targeting infrastructure rather than troop concentrations. The strategy was economical, conserving manpower while letting time do the work. Yet the besiegers faced their own challenges. Supply lines stretched back across hostile territory, vulnerable to partisan attacks. Winter affected them as well, freezing lubricants and slowing movement. Still, the imbalance was stark. German soldiers received regular rations, winter clothing, and rotation. They observed the city through binoculars, watching smoke rise from countless small fires as residents burned whatever they could find. Reports filtered up the chain of command, describing the effects of starvation, not with horror, but with bureaucratic detachment. Leningrad was being reduced as planned. On the eastern shore of Lake Ladoga, Soviet planners searched for a solution that defied geography and enemy fire. The lake, vast and treacherous, froze unevenly. If it could be crossed, even briefly, it might become a lifeline. Engineers tested the ice, measuring thickness with crude tools under the threat of air attack. The margin for error was slim, but there was no alternative. The city was dying, and delay meant annihilation. Preparations began for what would become known simply as the Road of Life, a phrase that carried hope and irony in equal measure.
The first convoys across Lake Ladoga were tentative, almost experimental. Trucks moved slowly, spaced apart to prevent cracking the ice, their engines rumbling like distant thunder beneath the frozen surface. Drivers kept doors open, ready to jump if the ice failed. Some did not escape in time. Vehicles broke through, disappearing into black water along with their cargo. Each loss was weighed against the lives saved by what did arrive. Flour, fuel, and ammunition reached the city in quantities that were never sufficient but always essential. On the return journey, trucks carried evacuees, children, the sick, and those deemed unlikely to survive another month. Many died on the road, their bodies stiffening in the cold before they reached the far shore. Air attacks targeted the convoys relentlessly, turning the frozen expanse into a killing ground marked by bomb craters and wreckage. Still, the road held. It was reinforced, rerouted, and expanded as winter deepened. Within the city, rations stabilized slightly, rising just enough to slow the rate of death. This was not recovery, only reprieve. The population had already been irrevocably altered. Entire families vanished, leaving apartments sealed with official notices. Yet the knowledge that the city was no longer completely alone mattered. Survival regained a future tense. People began to plan again, if only for the next week. The siege entered a new phase, defined not by immediate collapse, but by prolonged endurance. Spring brought thaw and disease. As the ice melted, the road of life dissolved back into water, and supply shifted to barges that were slower and more vulnerable. Decomposing bodies emerged from snowbanks and courtyards, forcing mass cleanup efforts, even as workers were barely strong enough to lift tools. Typhus and dysentery spread through weakened populations. The city smelled of decay and smoke, an odor that clung to clothing and memory. Yet factories increased output, having adapted to scarcity with grim efficiency. Children returned to classrooms that were little more than shelters, taught by teachers who collapsed at their desks between lessons. The German lines held firm through the summer of 1942, repelling attempts to break the encirclement. Each failed offensive added to the toll. But the city did not fall. Its population, reduced by hundreds of thousands, had crossed some internal threshold. Those who remained were hardened, stripped of illusions, but not of resolve. Cultural life persisted in reduced form. The performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in August 1942, played by a starving orchestra reinforced with soldiers pulled from the front, was broadcast through loudspeakers aimed at both the city and the enemy lines. It was less a concert than a declaration. Leningrad still existed. For German troops listening from their positions, the music carried across no man's land, distorted by distance and wind. It was not a tactical setback, but it unsettled assumptions. the city that was supposed to fade quietly into ruin continued to assert itself in ways that defied calculation. Meanwhile, Soviet High Command prepared a more methodical approach to lifting the siege. Resources were concentrated, artillery massed, and coordination improved. The winter of 1942-43 saw renewed pressure along the southern edge of the encirclement. When Operation Iskra began in January 1943, it aimed not at immediate liberation, but at opening a narrow corridor to the city. Fighting was brutal, conducted in forests and frozen marshes that neutralized mobility. Losses were heavy on both sides, but this time the breakthrough held. A land connection, precarious and constantly shelled, was established. Rail lines were laid under fire, restoring a tenuous but permanent supply route. Rations increased again, modestly but meaningfully. For the first time since 1941, Leningrad was no longer completely encircled. The siege, however, was not over. German artillery remained in range and bombardment continued. But the balance had shifted. Survival was no longer merely defensive. It had become cumulative, building toward an end that could now be imagined. The final year of the siege unfolded with a strange mixture of familiarity and anticipation. Bombardments continued, but people rebuilt damaged structures almost as quickly as they fell. Gardens were planted in courtyards and parks, every patch of soil pressed into service. Children who had grown up under siege learned to identify artillery by sound, a skill that would never be needed again, but would never be forgotten. The city's population stabilized, bolstered by limited returns and new evacuations. When the full lifting of the siege came in January 1944, it was marked by artillery salutes and cautious celebration. The encirclement that had lasted 872 days was broken. The cost was staggering. Estimates of civilian deaths ranged into the hundreds of thousands, primarily from starvation. Yet Leningrad stood. It had not been captured, erased, or silenced. The victory was not clean or triumphant in the conventional sense. It was heavy with absence. Streets were lined with buildings that stood only as shells, their interiors burned out. Families returned to apartments occupied by strangers or empty rooms where entire lives had ended. The end of the siege did not restore what had been lost, but it closed a chapter defined by sustained deprivation, unlike anything the city had known before or would again. In the aftermath, Soviet authorities moved quickly to frame the siege as a narrative of heroism and unity. Medals were issued, monuments planned, and official histories written. These accounts emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and victory, often smoothing over the more uncomfortable realities of chaos, mismanagement, and desperation. For survivors, memory was more fragmented. It lived in habits formed during hunger, in the inability to throw away food, in the reflex to save scraps for an emergency that no longer existed. Many never spoke of what they had seen or done. Others spoke constantly, compelled to ensure that the suffering was neither forgotten nor simplified. The siege became a reference point, a measure against which all future hardships were judged. It also became a warning. Leningrad demonstrated what modern war could inflict on civilians when cities became targets not to be taken, but to be extinguished. The decision to starve rather than assault had saved German lives at the expense of civilian ones, revealing a calculus that reduced humanity to logistics. For those inside the city, survival had required a different arithmetic, one that valued each day lived as a form of victory. The siege did not produce heroes in the romantic sense. It produced survivors, shaped by circumstances that demanded endurance rather than glory.
Years later, the physical scars of the siege faded as the city rebuilt, but the psychological landscape remained altered. Children who survived grew into adults with an acute awareness of fragility and resilience. They carried stories passed down in families, sometimes whispered, sometimes spoken bluntly. The siege entered literature, art, and collective memory, its meaning shifting with time and political context. During the Cold War, it was invoked as proof of ideological strength and sacrifice. Afterward, it was revisited with a more critical eye, acknowledging both courage and failure. What remained constant was the scale of civilian suffering and the stark lesson it offered. Leningrad had not been spared by chance or mercy. It had survived because its people endured conditions that should have been unendurable. That endurance was not uniform or noble in every instance, but it was real. It existed in millions of small decisions made under extreme pressure. The siege stands as a reminder that war's most profound consequences are often borne far from the front lines, by those with no control over the strategies that determine their fate. The geography of the siege still shapes the city's consciousness. The Neva River, Lake Ladoga, and the surrounding forests are not just features of the landscape, but markers of survival and loss. Memorials dot the outskirts, their simplicity reflecting the scale of what they represent. They do not celebrate conquest, but commemorate endurance. Each year, the anniversary of the siege's lifting is observed with solemnity rather than triumph. Bells toll, names are read, and silence is allowed its full weight. The passage of time has not diminished the event's gravity. If anything, it has clarified it. The Siege of Leningrad was not an anomaly, but an extreme expression of a broader reality of total war, where civilian populations became instruments and targets. Understanding it requires resisting both sensationalism and abstraction. It demands attention to the lived experience of hunger, cold, and fear, and to the systems that made those experiences possible. For historians, the siege offers a case study in the limits of human endurance and the consequences of strategic choices. It raises questions about responsibility, preparedness, and the ethics of warfare. Why was the city not evacuated more fully before encirclement? How did ideology shape decisions on both sides? What does survival mean when it comes at such cost? These questions resist easy answers. They are embedded in a context of urgency and uncertainty that defies retrospective clarity. What can be said with certainty is that the siege reshaped everyone it touched. It altered the city's demographics, its culture, and its memory. It also left a record of resilience that is neither comforting nor inspiring in a simple way. It is sobering. It reminds us that human beings can adapt to almost anything, but that adaptation often exacts a price that echoes long after the immediate danger has passed. The siege's legacy extends beyond Leningrad, influencing how cities are understood in modern warfare. It underscores the vulnerability of urban populations and the catastrophic impact of supply disruption. In an era when industrial capacity and civilian morale were integral to military strength, the line between combatant and non-combatant dissolved. Leningrad became a battlefield without trenches, its weapons hunger and cold. Remembering this is not an exercise in assigning blame alone, but in recognizing patterns that recur whenever war prioritizes objectives over lives. The city's survival did not negate the suffering inflicted upon it. Both truths coexist, and acknowledging them together is essential to any honest reckoning. Personal accounts from the siege often return to small moments: a shared crust of bread, a stranger helping someone up an icy stairwell,
the sound of music on a radio that should not have worked. These fragments carry more weight than statistics. They reveal how survival was constructed from acts that, in isolation, seem insignificant. The siege was endured not by abstract collectives, but by individuals whose names may never be known. Their experiences resist compression into a single narrative. They demand space, patience, and humility from those who seek to understand them. As the city moved forward, the siege became part of its identity, a reference point invoked in times of crisis. It shaped how Leningrad, later St. Petersburg, understood itself and its past. The memory was not static. It evolved as new generations engaged with it, sometimes questioning, sometimes reaffirming. What remained constant was the recognition that the siege represented a boundary crossed, a demonstration of how far war could go when unchecked. It stood as a warning, written in human cost. The physical remnants of the siege are now largely gone, replaced by reconstructed buildings and modern infrastructure. Yet the absence they mark is still perceptible. Entire neighborhoods were repopulated by people who had no connection to those who died there. The continuity of life was restored, but the continuity of memory required deliberate effort. Museums, archives, and commemorations serve that purpose, preserving evidence against forgetting.